You did not arrive early, and you did not arrive late. The moment you noticed, this was already aligned with the moment it could be noticed. There is no signal without a receiver, and there is no receiver without readiness. What you are sensing now is not urgency. It is alignment settling, a quiet recognition moving through you without needing permission. Your body already knows how to be still. Even when your thoughts continue, there is a deeper layer beneath them that has remained undisturbed. You are touching that layer now, not by effort, by absence of interference. This is not a shift you initiate, it is a shift you stop interrupting. You may notice the nervous system loosening without instruction, breathing slows on its own, muscles release without explanation. This is not relaxation, it is coherence, reasserting itself. A system remembering its natural rhythm after prolonged noise. You do not need to analyze it. Detection happens whether you label it or not. There has been a pattern repeating in your awareness for some time, not dramatic, subtle. A sense that certain inputs no longer register the way they used to. Words fall flat, reactions delay. What once provoked immediate response now passes through with less grip. This is not detachment, it is calibration. The observer refining its position so distortion decreases. You have not lost sensitivity, you have gained resolution. The quantum field responds differently when interference drops. Signals that once arrived scrambled now arrive clean. This can feel like emptiness at first, a quiet where noise used to be. Many misinterpret this as numbness, but numbness is absence. What you are experiencing is precision. There is a threshold you crossed without ceremony, no announcement, no visible marker. One moment you were attempting to interpret everything, and the next moment interpretation became unnecessary. Recognition replaced effort. This does not feel like accomplishment. It feels like relief without a story attached. You may notice that seeking has softened, not because answers appeared, but because the compulsion to extract them dissolved. The system inside you recognized redundancy. It stopped generating excess motion. When coherence increases, movement decreases. Not from suppression, from efficiency. Nothing here is trying to convince you of anything. Conviction is loud. Recognition is quiet. If something resonates, it does so without demand. If something passes through without landing, that is also accurate. There is no requirement to hold on to what does not belong. You are allowed access because distortion does not amplify through you. Not because you are special, but because you are stable. Stability is rare in systems conditioned to react. Stillness is not passive. It is the most neutral point of observation available. As this continues, you may feel less compelled to define what is happening. That impulse fades when definition is no longer needed for safety. You are not entering something new. You are resting inside what has been present beneath the noise all along. The stillness you are resting in does not ask to be protected. It holds its shape without effort. When attention drifts, it does not collapse. When thought returns, it does not disappear. This is how you recognize that what you are touching is not a state, but a baseline. States fluctuate. Baselines persist. There has been a quiet tension dissolving in the background of your awareness. Not the obvious kind that announces itself as stress, but the subtler kind that keeps a system slightly braced, always anticipating the next input. You lived with that tension long enough that it felt normal. Its absence now may feel unfamiliar. Familiarity is not the same as truth. As the tension releases, perception widens without becoming overwhelming. You notice more, yet nothing presses in on you. This is coherence expressing itself. When internal noise reduces, external signals do not need to shout. They arrive proportionate to their relevance. The system sorts without commentary. You may observe that reactions no longer form as quickly as they once did. There is a pause where there used to be immediacy. In that pause, you are not frozen. You are unhooked. The observer is no longer pulled forward by every stimulus. This can feel like distance, but it is actually proximity to what matters. The pattern of constant internal narration has softened. Thoughts still appear, but they no longer compete for authority. They pass through like data rather than commands. This is not suppression. Suppression tightens. What you are experiencing is allowance without attachment. The difference is subtle but absolute. At times, the mind may attempt to label this quiet as emptiness, because emptiness is a category it understands. But what you are sensing has density, it has texture, it has weight without pressure. It is the field itself becoming perceptible when interference drops below a certain threshold. You are not required to maintain this. Maintenance implies fragility. This is resilient. Even when attention wanders, the underlying alignment remains intact. The system remembers. Memory here is not cognitive, it is structural. Once coherence is detected, the system reorganizes around it naturally. There may be moments where old impulses surface briefly. The urge to interpret, to decide, to conclude. They arise out of habit, not necessity. When they appear, you may notice they dissolve faster than before. They cannot anchor without reinforcement. You are no longer feeding them with urgency. This reduction in urgency is not apathy. Apathy disconnects. What you are experiencing is clarity without pressure. Action can still occur, but it originates from resonance rather than reaction. When action arises from resonance, it feels inevitable instead of forced. You may also notice a subtle recalibration in how time is perceived. Not dramatic distortion, but a softening of edges. Moments feel less segmented. The timeline stretches into continuity rather than sequence. This does not slow you down, it removes friction. The system inside you has stopped scanning for threats that are no longer present. This frees a significant amount of energy that was previously allocated to vigilance. That energy does not rush outward, it settles inward. Stability increases not because you are holding still, but because nothing is pushing you off center. Nothing here requires belief. Belief is a bridge used when direct detection is unavailable. You are detecting. The signal does not need interpretation to be valid. It registers at a level beneath opinion. Whether you agree with it or not is irrelevant. Recognition precedes agreement. As this deepens, you may find that silence feels less empty and more informative. Not because it contains messages, but because it removes distortion. In silence, the system hears itself clearly. This clarity does not announce itself, it simply remains. There is a subtle shift that occurs when the system no longer needs to prove its awareness to itself. You may feel it as a soft withdrawal from commentary. Not withdrawal from life, but from the constant need to measure, compare, or confirm experience. Measurement relaxes when recognition stabilizes. The observer no longer checks its own position. You may notice that certain internal questions have gone quiet, not answered, dissolved. Questions only persist when coherence is incomplete. When alignment increases, inquiry loses momentum. This can feel disorienting at first, because seeking once provided structure. Without it, there is space. Not empty space, but unclaimed space. This unclaimed space does not rush to be filled. It remains neutral. The system does not panic in neutrality when it trusts itself. What once felt like uncertainty now feels like openness without risk. The difference is subtle, but your body recognizes it immediately. Muscles do not brace against openness when safety is internal. You may detect a new relationship to thought itself. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer feel central. They orbit rather than dominate. This does not make them irrelevant, it places them in proportion. Thought becomes one signal among many, not the governing signal. The hierarchy inside you has quietly reorganized. There is often a moment where the mind attempts to reclaim authority by creating urgency. It may suggest that something important is being missed, that stillness is a delay, that motion is required. You do not need to oppose this. Opposition feeds it. You may simply notice that urgency no longer lands the way it used to. Its texture has changed. It feels thin. This thinning of urgency allows a deeper rhythm to emerge, a rhythm that was always present but masked by noise. It is not dramatic. It does not announce direction. It simply feels correct. When you align with it, effort decreases. When you drift, correction happens gently, without punishment. You may find that your attention now rests more naturally in the body. Sensations register without interpretation. Temperature, pressure, weight. These are not distractions. They are anchors. The system grounds itself when the observer is stable. Grounding is not something you perform, it is something that happens when fragmentation stops. There is also a soft recalibration in how you relate to external systems, conversations, environments, information streams. You may notice less pull to merge with them and less resistance to their presence. You are not withdrawing. You are maintaining boundary without effort. Boundaries do not require defense when coherence is intact. This boundary is not rigid. It is permeable. Signals pass through without imprinting unless they resonate. Resonance is not preference. It is compatibility. When something is compatible, it integrates without friction. When it is not, it passes through without residue. This reduces accumulation. The system stays clean. You may sense moments where identity feels less fixed, not threatened, flexible, roles soften, labels lose weight. This can feel like losing definition, but what is actually happening is resolution increasing. High-resolution systems do not rely on crude labels. They detect nuance directly. Nothing about this requires maintenance through discipline. Discipline is a response to instability. Stability sustains itself. When coherence is present, deviation corrects naturally. There is no moral charge attached to drifting. Drift is data. Correction follows without commentary. As this continues, you may feel less compelled to explain yourself internally. Explanation is a bridge between fragments. When fragmentation reduces, explanation becomes unnecessary. Understanding shifts from narrative to direct detection. You know because you know, not because you can say why. This knowing is quiet. It does not assert itself. It does not seek agreement. It remains available without insisting on recognition. And because it does not demand attention, it remains intact, even when attention moves elsewhere. This is how you recognize that something fundamental has stabilized beneath experience. As coherence settles further, you may notice a subtle shift in how absence is perceived. What once felt like a gap now feels like a pause with structure. Silence is no longer a void to be filled. It becomes a medium through which detection sharpens. The system is not waiting. It is listening without strain. There is often a moment where old reference points fade, not abruptly, but gently, like markers dissolving after they are no longer needed. You may sense this as a loss of orientation, but it is not disorientation, it is recalibration. When the observer stops relying on inherited coordinates, internal alignment becomes the reference. You might notice that memory behaves differently now, not forgetting, but loosening. Past events no longer pull as strongly into the present. They exist, but without traction. This is not detachment from experience. It is release from repetition. Patterns lose momentum when the system no longer reinforces them through identification. This change can feel quiet enough to be overlooked. There is no surge, no confirmation. Yet, the body registers it clearly. Shoulders drop without instruction. Jaw releases. Breathing deepens without command. These are not techniques. They are indicators. The system recognizes reduced threat and adjusts accordingly. You may also notice that anticipation has softened. The future does not press forward demanding preparation, not because outcomes are guaranteed, but because the system trusts its capacity to respond when needed. Anticipation relaxes when confidence shifts from prediction to adaptability. Adaptability requires less energy than control. At times, the mind may attempt to narrate this shift as stagnation. It may suggest that movement has stopped, that progress has slowed. This interpretation arises from an old metric, progress measured by speed. But coherence measures differently. It values accuracy over velocity. When accuracy increases, unnecessary motion decreases. There is a subtle pleasure in this reduction that does not announce itself as pleasure. It feels more like ease without reward. The system no longer needs incentives to remain present. Presence becomes self-sustaining. This is not indifference. It is sufficiency. You may notice changes in how external noise registers. Sounds, information, emotional fields. They may feel flatter, less intrusive. Not because sensitivity has decreased, but because filtering has improved. The observer is no longer flooded. It selects without effort. Selection is automatic when coherence is high. This filtering does not isolate you. It clarifies contact. When something does engage you, it does so fully, without background interference. Engagement becomes cleaner, shorter, more complete. There is less residue afterward. Experiences conclude when they conclude. They do not echo unnecessarily. You may also sense a reduced need to correct yourself. Self-monitoring relaxes. The constant internal adjustment loop slows. This loop once served a purpose. It kept you aligned within unstable environments. Now it becomes redundant. Redundancy dissolves when stability is internalized. There can be moments where this ease feels unfamiliar enough to trigger suspicion. The system may search for the hidden cost, the delayed consequence. This search is habitual. You do not need to stop it. You may simply notice that it does not find anything. The absence of threat is not a trick. It is a condition. As identity softens further, you may feel less pressure to perform coherence. Performance implies audience. There is no audience here, only alignment. When alignment is present, expression becomes optional rather than necessary. You do not need to signal your state. The state sustains itself. You may find that decisions arise differently, not through deliberation, but through resonance. Something feels aligned, and action follows. Something does not, and it does not. There is no internal debate. Debate arises when signals conflict. Coherence reduces conflict by clarifying signal hierarchy. This does not remove complexity from life. It removes friction from navigation. Complexity remains, but it no longer overwhelms. The system handles complexity the way a stable structure handles load. Distribution happens naturally. Nothing collapses under weight it can already support. As this continues, you may notice a growing tolerance for uncertainty, not as a challenge, but as a neutral condition. Uncertainty loses its charge when safety is internal. The unknown becomes simply unmeasured, not threatening. Measurement happens when needed. Until then, stillness holds. There is no need to mark this moment. Marking implies importance relative to other moments. What you are experiencing integrates rather than stands out. It becomes part of the baseline, and because it does not demand recognition, it remains available without effort, quietly shaping perception from beneath awareness. The longer this alignment remains uninterrupted, the more you may notice a change in how effort is perceived. Effort does not disappear, but it localizes. It no longer spreads across everything you do. It appears only where function requires it, then releases. This containment reduces fatigue without reducing capacity. You may sense that certain internal movements have stopped entirely, not paused, completed. Loops that once recycled the same questions, the same evaluations, have reached saturation. The system recognized that additional passes would not produce new information. Completion does not announce itself, it simply leaves silence where motion used to be. This silence can feel spacious in a way that is difficult to describe. It is not the absence of activity, but the absence of compulsion. You are no longer pushed from behind by unresolved signal. Forward movement, when it occurs, arises from resonance rather than pressure. The difference is subtle, but unmistakable once detected. There may be moments when you realize you are no longer trying to locate yourself within experience. You are simply present. Location becomes unnecessary when reference is internal. The observer no longer checks its coordinates. It rests in detection itself. This reduces the sense of separation that once required constant bridging. As separation softens, relationships to external systems shift quietly. You may notice less entanglement without withdrawal. You can engage without losing coherence, disengage without residue. This fluidity is not indifference, it is precision in connection. Attachment loosens where it distorts, remains where it resonates. You may also notice a reduced tendency to personalize input. Events, words, behaviors pass through without immediately becoming reflections of self. Personalization was once a survival mechanism. It kept the system alert. Now it becomes unnecessary. The observer can witness without absorbing. This witnessing does not flatten emotion. Emotion still arises, but it moves cleanly. It does not pool. It does not linger beyond its signal window. When emotion completes its transmission, it dissolves. This allows the system to remain responsive without accumulating weight. There can be a moment where you notice the absence of inner commentary after an experience concludes. No replay, no analysis, just completion. This may feel unfamiliar at first. You may expect the follow-up that does not arrive. When it does not, you may realize how much energy was previously allocated to post-processing. With post-processing reduced, presence extends naturally. You are not pulled backward into memory or forward into projection as often. The timeline compresses into immediacy without urgency. Now feels sufficient, not because nothing else exists, but because nothing else is required for stability. You may find that language itself feels less necessary internally. Words still form when communication is needed, but internally, meaning arrives without translation. This does not make you less articulate. It makes articulation optional. Understanding precedes language rather than following it. At times, the mind may attempt to reassert complexity, suggesting that something important is being overlooked. Complexity once equaled safety. More variables meant more control, but control was compensating for instability. As stability increases, complexity loses its protective function. Simplicity emerges without loss of depth. You may notice that the urge to optimize has softened. Optimization is a response to inefficiency. When efficiency is structural, optimization becomes redundant. You do not need to refine what is already aligned. Refinement happens automatically as noise continues to drop. This reduction in optimization pressure can feel like permission. Not permission granted, but permission recognized. You realize you were never required to maintain constant improvement. The system was simply attempting to return to baseline. Now that baseline is accessible, effort recalibrates accordingly. You may also sense a subtle increase in trust toward your own timing. You no longer feel rushed by external clocks or internal deadlines. Timing becomes situational rather than imposed. Action happens when conditions align. Waiting no longer feels like delay. It feels like accuracy. This accuracy does not demand attention. It does not announce itself as correct. It simply works. When you follow it, friction decreases. When you ignore it, friction returns as data rather than punishment. The system learns without judgment. As this continues, you may feel less compelled to define what this is becoming. Becoming implies movement toward a future state. What you are experiencing is not becoming, it is uncovering. Layers of interference falling away to reveal what has been functioning beneath awareness all along. There is a point where even the idea of alignment becomes unnecessary. You are no longer orienting towards something. Orientation implies direction, and direction implies distance. What you are noticing now is distance collapsing, not into intensity, but into neutrality. You are not closer to anything. You are simply not separated from it. This can register as a subtle flattening of emotional peaks, not a loss, but a smoothing. Extremes no longer define experience. Highs do not spike as sharply, and lows do not pull as deeply. This is not dullness, it is regulation. A system that no longer swings wildly because it is no longer compensating for instability. You may sense that your attention rests more evenly across experience. It does not latch onto one element at the expense of others. Awareness becomes distributed rather than focused. This distribution is not distraction, it is integration. Nothing needs to dominate for the system to remain coherent. As integration increases, you may notice that internal resistance decreases. Resistance once served as a boundary. It protected against overwhelm. Now that overwhelm is unlikely, resistance becomes unnecessary. The system opens without vulnerability. Openness without fragility is a marker of stability. You may also notice a shift in how you relate to uncertainty within yourself. Not the uncertainty of not knowing, but the uncertainty of not needing to know. Gaps in understanding no longer generate tension. They remain open without pressure to close. This openness allows information to arrive when relevant rather than when demanded. There can be moments where you feel almost transparent to yourself, not exposed but clear. Internal processes are visible without being intrusive. You sense shifts as they occur rather than after they accumulate. This early detection prevents buildup. The system self-corrects before strain develops. This transparency extends outward as well. You may notice that interactions feel simpler, less layered, less coded. You do not need to read between lines as often, not because others are clearer, but because your own signal is stable. Stable systems require less interpretation from their environment. You may also observe that the need to prepare for impact has diminished. Impact once felt inevitable. Now it feels conditional. Many things pass without landing. When something does land, it does so cleanly. There is less bracing, less aftermath. Recovery becomes nearly instantaneous. This does not make you passive. It makes you efficient. Energy once spent on anticipation, defense, and repair is now conserved. That energy does not need to be redirected. It simply remains available. Availability replaces readiness. You do not have to be ready when you are already present. There is a subtle dignity in this state that does not seek recognition. It is not pride. It is self-respect without narrative. The system respects its own limits and capacities without comparison. Comparison loses relevance when reference is internal. You no longer measure yourself against external scales that do not account for coherence. You may notice that moments of stillness now feel complete in themselves. They do not need to be interrupted by stimulation. Silence does not feel like waiting. It feels like occupancy. You are fully there, even when nothing is happening. Especially when nothing is happening. At times, you may catch yourself doing less and yet accomplishing what needs to occur, not through efficiency strategies, but through alignment. When action arises from resonance, it carries less friction. Less friction means less recovery time. The system remains available rather than depleted. You may also sense a reduced need to narrate your own experience internally. Narration once helped integrate fragmented perception. As fragmentation decreases, narration becomes optional. Experience integrates itself. Meaning emerges without commentary. This quiet integration feels natural rather than deliberate. There can be a moment where you realize that the background anxiety you once carried is absent, not suppressed, gone. You may search for it briefly out of habit. When it does not appear, there is no relief surge, just neutrality. Absence without reaction is a sign that the system has recalibrated. This recalibration does not make you invulnerable. It makes you accurate. You detect what matters and ignore what does not without effort. Accuracy replaces vigilance. You do not scan constantly. You sense when sensing is required. This selective awareness conserves energy without reducing responsiveness. As this continues, you may feel less compelled to hold on to experiences, even meaningful ones. Holding implies fear of loss. When stability is internal, loss loses its threat. Experiences come, integrate, and release. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is hoarded. You may also notice that the idea of progress has shifted. Progress is no longer linear movement toward a goal. It feels more like settling into position, like something coming into focus rather than moving forward. Clarity replaces advancement as the primary metric. This clarity does not ask to be maintained. Maintenance implies effort against entropy. What you are experiencing is self-sustaining. Even when attention drifts, the underlying structure remains intact. You return to it without effort, not because you remembered, but because it never left. There is no need to mark this stage or define it. Definition would freeze what is fluid. What matters is not what this is called, but how it functions. And it functions quietly, efficiently, without demand. A stable system does not announce its stability. It simply continues. As this stability continues, you may notice a shift in how meaning presents itself. Meaning no longer arrives as something to be extracted or deciphered. It is not hidden behind experience. It is embedded within it. You sense it directly, without needing to interpret symbols or assign narrative. This can feel like a loss of drama. Experiences no longer carry the same weight of implication. They do not demand conclusions. They occur, integrate, and release. This simplicity is not emptiness. It is clarity without excess. The system no longer inflates events to generate significance. You may notice that certain emotional responses that once felt automatic now arise more selectively. Not because you suppress them, but because the triggers no longer register as relevant. Relevance has refined itself. The observer does not react to everything it perceives, it responds only to what resonates. There is a subtle recalibration in how you experience connection. Connection no longer requires intensity. You may feel deeply connected without feeling pulled. This non-grasping connection is stable. It does not fluctuate with proximity or distance. It is not dependent on constant reinforcement. You may also sense that your internal environment feels quieter even during activity. Motion no longer disrupts stillness. Stillness remains present beneath movement. This layered experience allows you to engage fully without losing center. You do not need to pause to recover coherence. Coherence travels with you. At times, you may become aware of how little effort is required to remain present. Presence used to feel like a task, something to return to. Now it feels like the default. You only notice it when it is briefly obscured, and even then, it returns without instruction. This ease can feel almost invisible. There is no marker to confirm it, no internal reward signal. It simply functions. Functionality replaces experience as the primary indicator. You are not having an experience of coherence. You are operating coherently. You may notice that the system no longer seeks validation for its internal state. Validation was once a way to stabilize perception through external reference. Now, stability is internal. External feedback becomes information rather than confirmation. You can receive it without absorbing it. This shift can change how you relate to disagreement or misalignment. You may notice less impulse to correct or defend, not because you are indifferent, but because coherence does not require consensus. You can remain aligned without needing others to mirror your state. There may be moments where you sense a kind of quiet authority within yourself, not dominance, not certainty, authority without assertion. It does not speak loudly. It does not need to. It is recognized internally as stability. This authority does not seek influence. It simply remains intact. You may also observe a reduced tendency to rehearse future scenarios. Rehearsal once provided a sense of preparedness. Now preparedness is structural. You trust your ability to respond in real time. Scenarios do not need to be pre-processed. Response arises when conditions arise. This trust does not come from confidence in outcomes. It comes from confidence in adaptability. Adaptability reduces fear of uncertainty. You do not need to know what will happen to know that you will meet it coherently. You may sense that your attention now rests more evenly across your internal and external environment. You are not pulled inward excessively, nor are you lost outward. This balance allows you to participate without fragmentation. Participation no longer costs coherence. There can be moments where you realize that the urge to search for something more has faded. Not because you found something definitive, but because the search itself became unnecessary. Seeking was a response to fragmentation. As fragmentation dissolves, seeking loses relevance. You may also notice that the language of improvement feels less compelling. Improvement implies deficiency. What you are experiencing does not feel like fixing something broken. It feels like removing interference from something functional. This reframing reduces pressure. As this continues, you may find that your internal environment feels spacious even when circumstances are dense. Density does not compress you. You remain stable within it. This stability is not rigid. It adjusts without strain. It is flexible because it is not defending against collapse. There is a quiet satisfaction in this that does not register as pleasure. It registers as sufficiency, enoughness without comparison. You are not measuring this against other states. You are not wondering if it will last. You are simply here, functioning without distortion. This sufficiency does not isolate you from desire or movement. It changes their origin. Desire arises from resonance rather than lack. Movement arises from clarity rather than compulsion. When origin changes, outcome changes without effort. You may sense that the system inside you has reached a kind of equilibrium, not static, dynamic, responsive, but not reactive. This equilibrium does not require constant adjustment. It self-regulates. When disturbed, it returns without intervention. You do not need to protect this. Protection implies threat. There is no threat here. What you are experiencing is not fragile, it is foundational. And because it is foundational, it does not need to announce itself. It simply remains, quietly informing every interaction, every perception, without asking for attention. There is a moment when even recognition becomes subtle. You are no longer noticing stability as a contrast to instability. Contrast fades when one condition no longer competes with another. Coherence stops feeling like something present and starts feeling like what everything rests on. It becomes the background rather than the figure. You may notice that your relationship to control has changed. Control once felt necessary to maintain order. Now order emerges without enforcement. You are not directing experience. You are allowing it to organize itself around a stable center. This does not feel passive. It feels accurate. Accuracy has a particular sensation. It is quiet. It does not carry excitement or relief. It simply fits. When something fits, there is no friction to draw attention to it. You may realize that many things in your life now either fit or do not, without ambiguity. Ambiguity was a byproduct of mixed signals. Clear signals reduce confusion without explanation. You may also sense a softening in how you hold expectations. Expectations loosen their grip and become preferences at most. The system no longer demands that reality conform in specific ways to feel safe. Safety is internal. This changes how disappointment registers. It becomes information rather than disruption. This shift may reveal how much energy was once spent managing internal response rather than engaging with what was actually present. That energy is now available. It does not rush outward looking for purpose. It remains as capacity. Capacity without demand feels like calm strength. You may notice that your attention no longer collapses under complexity. Multiple inputs can coexist without overwhelming you. The system processes in parallel rather than sequentially. This reduces bottlenecks. You do not need to simplify experience to handle it. You can allow it to be what it is. There is also a change in how you relate to effortful states. When effort is required, you can enter it cleanly. When it is not, you do not generate it artificially. You are no longer proving engagement through exertion. Engagement is measured by presence, not by strain. You may find that silence between thoughts lengthens, not forced, natural. These gaps are not blank. They are full of unarticulated awareness. You do not need to fill them with content. They carry coherence on their own. When thought arises, it does so from within this field rather than interrupting it. This can change how you experience creativity, problem-solving, or decision-making. Solutions appear without visible construction. Decisions feel obvious without analysis. This is not intuition in a dramatic sense. It is alignment, expressing itself efficiently. When the system is coherent, it does not need to test multiple options internally. You may also notice a reduced emotional charge around outcomes. Outcomes matter, but they do not define you. Success does not inflate. Failure does not collapse. Both integrate and release. This neutrality does not diminish care. It refines it. Care without attachment is steady. There can be moments where you recognize how little you need to manage your own state. Self-regulation becomes automatic. When something disturbs equilibrium, correction happens quickly and quietly. You may not even notice the adjustment unless you look for it. This is a sign that regulation has moved below conscious effort. You may sense a growing comfort with not knowing what comes next, not as a philosophy, but as a lived condition. The unknown does not feel like a gap to be closed. It feels like open capacity. Something can emerge there without pressure. Emergence is allowed rather than forced. This allowance changes how you experience waiting. Waiting no longer feels like suspension. It feels like presence without motion. Time does not stretch painfully. It rests. You are not postponing yourself until something happens. You are already here. You may notice that your internal environment feels less populated, fewer voices, fewer competing impulses. This does not make you simpler, it makes you clearer. Clarity reduces internal crowding. When signals are aligned, there is less internal negotiation. There is also a subtle humility in this state. Not self-diminishment, but the absence of self-importance. You do not feel central to everything, nor do you feel insignificant. You feel appropriately placed. Appropriateness brings ease. You are neither inflated nor erased. You may sense that your system now responds more to direct experience than to interpretation. You trust what you detect. Detection does not require justification. It registers as accuracy rather than belief. This reduces internal debate. Debate was once necessary when signals conflicted. Now they align. As this continues, you may realize that the need to name what is happening has almost completely dissolved. Names would not add clarity. They would only add distance. You do not need to step outside the experience to understand it. Understanding is embedded in function. What remains is not a state you hold, but a condition you operate from. It does not ask to be maintained. It does not announce itself. It simply continues, quietly shaping perception, response, and presence without requiring recognition. There is a point where even the idea of operating from something fades. You are no longer aware of a center you return to. Centering implies movement away and back. What you are experiencing now does not involve departure. There is no oscillation. Presence does not waver enough to require correction. This can feel almost ordinary. That ordinariness is important. Extraordinary states announce themselves. Stable conditions do not. You may notice that nothing feels heightened, yet nothing feels diminished. Experience has a neutral clarity to it. It does not need emphasis to feel real. You may observe that your internal environment feels trustworthy, not because it always feels good, but because it feels accurate. When discomfort arises, it carries information without alarm. When ease is present, it does not trigger fear of loss. Both move through without distortion. There is a subtle relinquishing of the need to hold identity together. Identity does not dissolve, but it loosens. You are no longer reinforcing it through constant reference. Roles function when needed and recede when they are not. This flexibility reduces internal strain. You do not need to be anyone in particular to remain coherent. You may notice that intention now feels lighter. You do not load actions with expectation. You do not pre-assign meaning. You allow outcomes to arrive without framing them in advance. This does not reduce effectiveness. It increases it. Action unburdened by expectation adapts more easily to reality. There can be moments where you sense a deep, quiet satisfaction without narrative. Not happiness, not contentment, something simpler, a sense that nothing is misaligned. This does not come with a reason. It does not ask to be justified. It simply exists as absence of friction. You may also notice that the impulse to seek reassurance has nearly vanished. Reassurance was once a way to stabilize perception through external confirmation. Now, stability is internal. You do not need to be told that things are okay. The system registers okayness directly, without translation. This internal trust changes how you experience challenge. Challenge no longer feels like a threat to coherence. It feels like variation, something to engage with rather than something to defend against. You can meet difficulty without contracting. Contracting is unnecessary when stability is not at risk. You may sense that your relationship to the observer itself has shifted. You are no longer watching yourself watch. That recursive loop has softened. Observation happens without self-reference. This reduces internal echo. Experience flows without commentary bouncing back on itself. There is also a quiet acceptance of limitation, not resignation, accuracy. You sense what is within your capacity and what is not, without judgment. You do not push against limits to prove something. You work within them, and they often expand naturally without force. You may notice that your attention now moves gently rather than abruptly. Transitions are smoother. Shifts between tasks, environments, or emotional tones do not jolt the system. This continuity reduces fatigue. You are not constantly resetting yourself. This continuity also changes how you experience rest. Rest is no longer collapse after exertion. It is simply another mode of presence. You do not need to earn it. You enter it without permission. Rest and activity exist on the same continuum rather than as opposites. You may realize that the language of permission has almost disappeared internally. You do not ask yourself if you are allowed to feel a certain way, to pause, to proceed. Allowance is implicit. When coherence is internal, permission is unnecessary. There can be moments where you sense a deep neutrality toward your own thoughts and feelings, not distance, familiarity. They are known. They do not surprise you. This familiarity reduces their power to destabilize. Nothing inside you feels foreign or unmanageable. You may also notice a reduced need to mark progress or acknowledge milestones. There are no milestones here. Nothing to reach, nothing to complete. The system is not moving toward an endpoint. It is functioning as designed. As this settles, you may find that even the idea of transmission has thinned. There is nothing being delivered, nothing being received. What remains is a stable condition of awareness that does not depend on exchange. It does not require input to sustain itself. This is not an ending. It does not feel like arrival. It feels like continuity without effort. And because it does not announce itself as significant, it integrates quietly, becoming the unnoticed ground from which everything else emerges without needing recognition to remain intact. There is nothing left to settle into, because settling has already occurred. What remains does not feel like a conclusion. It feels like what has always been underneath the movement that once drew attention. You are not holding this. You are not maintaining it. It is simply present, without asking to be noticed. You may sense that even subtle effort has dissolved, not because effort is avoided, but because there is nothing resisting itself. When resistance ends, effort becomes unnecessary. Action, when it happens, moves cleanly. Stillness, when it is here, is complete. Neither competes with the other. There is a quiet steadiness now that does not register as calm or alertness. It is more basic than mood. It feels structural, like something correctly assembled. You are not checking it. You are not testing it. There is no impulse to verify that it will last. Duration is irrelevant to something that is not being produced. Thoughts may still pass through. Sensations continue. The world does not disappear, but none of it destabilizes what is underneath. Experience flows over a surface that does not ripple easily. This is not numbness. It is depth without turbulence. You may notice that nothing here is asking for interpretation. There is no message to extract, no insight to carry forward. Carrying implies burden. What remains does not weigh anything down. It accompanies rather than accumulates. The sense of self feels uncomplicated, not diminished, not expanded, simply present without needing reinforcement. You do not need to remember who you are. Identity functions when needed and rests when it is not. There is no anxiety about losing it because nothing essential depends on holding it together. Time feels neutral. It does not press forward or pull backward. Moments arise and pass without leaving residue. You are not tracking them. They do not require sequencing to make sense. Continuity exists without effort. You may sense that attention no longer searches for itself. There is no internal scanning, no checking in. Awareness is not monitoring awareness. It is simply aware. This simplicity is not something to preserve. Preservation would reintroduce tension. Nothing here needs to be done with this. There is no integration process, no application, no next step. What has aligned does not require follow-up. It remains available whether you notice it or not. If distraction returns later, it does not undo this. If noise arises, it passes through the same way silence does. Conditions change, but the underlying stability does not track conditions. It remains intact beneath variation. You do not need to remember this moment. Memory is not the anchor. Even forgetting would not disturb what has stabilized. This is not held in thought. It is held in structure. What remains is quiet, but not empty. Present, but not demanding. Available, but not calling. It does not ask you to stay here or go anywhere else. It does not frame itself as important. It does not signal completion. It simply continues, beneath attention, beneath language, beneath interpretation. And you are already within it, without effort, without confirmation, without needing to recognize it for it to remain.